What would you consider to be the first Japanese RPG? For most, that answer would be Dragon Quest, and if that's your answer, then I don't really blame you. The game was a huge success and is often labeled as the cornerstone that set the entire genre in motion. But to call it the first Japanese RPG? Let's just say there's a reason this video exists. Over 2 years prior, a role-playing game appeared on Japanese home computers that would become an influence for franchises to come, including quite possibly Dragon Quest itself. Its history and legacy have unfortunately been largely forgotten about, so in this video I'm going to take a dive and tell the tale of the game that, for all intents and purposes, can be considered the first Japanese RPG. But before I start talking about it, if you think this video ends up turning out to be worth your time, please consider subscribing and sharing this video to those who you think might be interested. Any support is very much appreciated, and I thank you in advance if you do so. Allow me to introduce you to the game known as the Black Onyx, first released sometime in January 1984 for the NEC PC-8801. It was later ported to NEC's other computer lines, the lesser 6001 and greater 9801, the MSX, where some parts of Europe will get a taste of the action, the Fujitsu FM7, and the Sega SG-1000 of all consoles. It would also be reprogrammed twice, first to the Famicom under the title Super Black Onyx, and much later to the Game Boy Color. As a quick heads up, most of the footage you'll see here comes from the MSX version. I also recorded the SG-1000 version, but thinking about it, that might give me the only real chance I have to talk about that system, so I think I'll embrace the opportunity and save that for its own video. The game places you in Utsuro, a town cursed to be in constant nighttime. As a party of up to 5 characters, your goal is to find the Black Onyx and bring daylight back to the town. The characters are randomly generated. You can give them their name and their appearance, but beyond that, their HP is generated randomly, as well as how much gold they have. Gold is held individually, which means when buying stuff, that character uses their own pocket change. It's not pooled together. The main gameplay is a dungeon crawler, as you run around places in a first-person view. The game's combat system, however, is one of the most bare-bones systems you will ever experience. There's only 3 commands: attack, talk to the opposition, or run. A magic system does not exist in this game. There is also no concept of range, meaning all the weapons are melee. If your party is less than 5 and you talk to an opposing fighter, there's a chance that you might get them to join you, or you can rob them of their gold. Beyond that, the first part of the game is nothing but whiffs, low damage, and enemies running when they're outmatched. Enemies running really doesn't sound as bad as you think. As long as you take at least one out, everybody gets experience. Getting gold, on the other hand, is a much different story. It only drops when you face an encounter in specific areas in the dungeon. Until you can find them, you really have no choice but to play it safe. Of course, there are shops to upgrade your weapons and armor, as well as a place to both heal and pick up potions. By the way, potions are your only source of healing outside the town. If one of your characters gets taken out, that's it, they are gone. And that's pretty much how the game works. It is, without a doubt, one of the most bare-bones role-playing games you're ever going to experience. But remember, this game first came out at the start of 1984, right smack in the middle of gaming's dark ages. The story behind the game, however, is absolutely fascinating. To tell that tale, I need to go back about a year to early 1983. 1983 was a critical point in gaming history. Obviously, the North American industry was completely imploding on itself, what with an oversaturated market, inexperienced third parties releasing games with the quality of a radioactive waste dump, Atari being stricken with an ultimately fatal case of hubris which got their name sold off, blah blah blah. Look, let's be honest here, the story's been run to the fucking ground. On the other side of the Pacific, Japan's player base was largely tied to its arcades, which was starting to have some trouble of its own. This led to some companies, most prominently Nintendo and Sega, trying their hand at the home console market, which at the time was largely seen as an American novelty. There's a certain individual living in this country at this point. He works for room and board at his father's gem industry, has not a single clue how to read, speak, or write Japanese, and yet he's looking around to see what kind of games this place is interested in. That man's name is Hank Rogers. Wait, why does that name sound familiar? Am I just getting deja vu here or something? Inconsequential. Rogers at this point was fascinated by Dungeons & Dragons, and upon noticing that the personal computer game roster was a bit lacking, he comes to realize, I could make this work out. He literally could not have had a better time to take this on for 2 major reasons. First, in 1983, the role-playing game was completely foreign to Japan. Even the original Dungeons & Dragons tabletop was about as niche as Christianity is there. Groups exist, but you really had to search for them. On top of that, the more famous computer RPGs like Wizardry and Ultima wouldn't officially get into Japan until at earliest the middle of November 1985. The second thing has its ties to the North American industry crashing and burning like it is. The two main effects the crash had on Japan were 1, the partnership between Sega and Coleco collapsing, which resulted in Sega going at it alone with the SG-1000, and 2, because home computers were starting to engage in price wars in that region, all of a sudden parts for them got dirt cheap. Japan took full advantage of it. While its PC player base wasn't going to reach the levels of North America and especially Europe, Japan's gaming industry was about to evolve really quickly. And so Rogers would set off to find the right personal computer for him to carry out his ambitions. Ultimately, he picked not just what was the system most consumers would get over the decade, but also where many a future famous gaming company would get their start, the PC-88. As he began his work, Rogers had everything that made Dungeons & Dragons fun in his head. Warriors and wizards, many dungeons, a whole bunch of monsters, the whole 9 yards. There was just one major roadblock in his way. How the hell are you gonna fit all that into just 64K of space? The short answer? By cutting corners like a corporation experiencing late-stage capitalism. Because of the memory limitation, the world had to be severely nerfed. First, Rogers could only technically make a single class for the game, that being the warrior. The concept of a magic system was intended, but since warriors under normal circumstances don't cast magic, it was thrown out the window as well. The world around the town of Utsuro was also intended to be larger, but because of the memory limitations, it had to be cut to just the town and a single dungeon technically. I say technically because if you play the game, it feels like there's 2 dungeons. What's really happening is that they're sharing the same floor plan. Utsuro itself is also half finished, with several buildings having absolutely nothing in them. Even more egregious are 3 sets of double doors on the town walls that you cannot interact with whatsoever. It gives them the vibe of a door that's locked by DLC. Look, it was the mid-80s and memory limitations were a problem across all platforms. There was a legitimate excuse here. All Rogers could do was simply put all the vital pieces together to make a game that performs well enough that it gets some eventual recognition. Over the course of the year, Rogers would work on the game, and when it was nearing completion, his brother would test the game, all while having to completely rely on his wife since he had no knowledge of the Japanese language. After getting an investment fund, dealing with software publishers to see if anybody could take the game, and getting some help from a friend to cover the game's artwork, the Black Onyx finally released. Things didn't go smoothly. To start off, the game's cover art has a Western aesthetic since it was done by a Westerner. For Japanese consumers, nobody really understood what was going on, even with screenshots of the game available. Though, to be fair, outside of arcades, Japan's gaming industry had really yet to find its footing at this point, so a part of this can be excusable. What could not be excused, however, was just how badly this game was bombing. By the end of February 1984, the Black Onyx sold a whopping 4 copies. 4. This was looking like it was about to be an unmitigated disaster. His investment money running out, Rogers opted for one final act of desperation. With a translator, Rogers set out to the headquarters of every major gaming magazine in Japan at the time. Introducing the game to their editors, he would help in character creation and then left them alone to experience the Black Onyx. The tactic worked. Reviews came in with great reception, and things finally took off from there. The Black Onyx went from selling not even 10 copies in March to 10,000 in April alone. Another 10,000 sales were recorded in May, and by the end of the year, it was the best-selling Japanese home computer game of 1984 with over 150,000 sold. Keep in mind, the home computer game market was fledgling at this point. Even a fifth of that would have been considered massive. Despite the language barrier and all the adversity leading up to this point, Hank Rogers pulled through. All he could do now was try to add to a game that he cut so much out of. Now with an actual team, Rogers set out to expand upon his original creation. His first expansion, which was actually called the Black Onyx 2 on the MSX, was known as the Fire Crystal. This expansion actually had a magic system, which made combat much more interesting than just both sides clobbering the hell out of each other. 2 other expansions were planned into the Moonstone, which allowed the party to explore the wilderness, and the Arena, which dealt with arena battles. However, by the time the Fire Crystal released on other home computers, which was in early '86, the genre was starting to shift once again. By this point, the first Wizardry had finally hit the Islands, which ironically would become a bigger franchise there than in its western roots, as well as paving the way for Dragon Quest to come roughly 6 months later. On the subject of Dragon Quest, it's often considered to be the first Japanese, and if you want to call a greater scope, Eastern RPG, as well as the first console RPG, when in reality, it's neither of those 2 things. This video already tears down the first claim, but in regards to console RPGs, it was beaten to the punch by a couple games in the West, those being Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Treasure of Tarman for the Intellivision, and earlier than that, Dragonstalker for the 2600, which I actually made a video about. Dragon Quest is, however, the first of both to go mainstream, on account of taking advantage of the current conditions of the industry. When it released, the Famicom was huge. Having Akira Toriyama do the artwork with his seminal Dr. Slump and then in production Dragon Ball being huge, it just worked out. Rogers took notice of this. Even though the Black Onyx helped the Japanese public become familiar with the idea, he knew he wasn't going to be able to compete for long. Those guys knew the culture well. Rogers, not so much. Ultimately, the world surrounding the town of Utsuro would never be fully realized. After his company produced a couple different games over 1986 and 87, Rogers would fly to the US to visit the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in June 1988. There, he would have his fateful encounter with a certain falling block game that was originally made from 100% pure undistilled communism. He later became friends with the creator of that game, in due part to having the shared interest of being game developers. The rest of that story is well known, not to mention a different subject entirely. But even though Hank Rogers' name will always be tied to that game, the Black Onyx is still significant for its own reasons. For one, it was created as an influence for quite a few franchises. One franchise directly influenced by it was Highlight. Yes, this franchise has a negative reputation, no thanks to the NES game being a complete dumpster fire, but the home computer versions aren't anywhere near as bad. On the other side of the coin, it was also an influence for, wait for it, The Legend of Zelda. What, you don't believe me? Well, you don't have to. Instead, let me defer that to somebody who knows this franchise quite well. This is taken from a documentary that was made sometime in late 2003.
生まれた時のいきさつはね、何やったかな。やっぱりね、パソコンゲームのブラックオニキスとかウルティマみたいな影響を受けてるんですよね。本当は何も受けてないと理想なんですけどね。ただまあ、そこから受けた影響っていうのはもう単に、ああいう関係の人たちが僕のキャラは、今これぐらいな強さだっていうことを自慢し合ってるっていうその姿が面白くてね。で、だからそれは原点になってますよね。ただそれをどんな風に面白いと思うかで、僕は僕のキャラが強くなるというところだけが面白かったんですよ。で、それ以外のそういうゲームの作業性のような要素は全然面白いと思ってなくて。
Checkmate. The other thing about the Black Onyx is, because of its success, it allowed the Japanese public to become familiar with the idea. Had it been a bust, it's kinda hard to say how Wizardry and Ultima would have fared when they came to Japan. Quite frankly, it's not my business to think about. What's done is done. But all of this stems from the bold efforts of just one guy who barely had a clue about the culture of the country he lived in, yet ultimately became a major piece in the shifting gaming industry. Hank Rogers, the man who not just brought the game of Tetris into the mainstream, but could also claim to be the man who kick-started the genre that is the Eastern RPG. How's that for a resume? And that's the tale of the background and legacy of the Black Onyx. While yes, by today's standards this game is super bare bones, it is still a significant piece of work. Even if it was mostly a Japanese exclusive, it's a great shame that the recognition it gets is borderline zero. I say borderline because somebody did make an English translation of the PC-88 original, which is actually one of just a handful of games on the system to get such treatment. There was also one for the Sega SG-1000 version, which I actually played to completion since it was the easiest one for me to control. However, as I mentioned near the start of this video, that might possibly be the only opportunity I have to talk about the SG-1000, or at least one of its games in depth. So I'm embracing that opportunity and giving that version its own video. That and I cringe at the thought of making an hour-long video for anything. Fuck that. So if you want to see me beat this game without the background attached to it, check out that video when it comes up. For now, I'll just end this video with this. If you're interested in the origins of Japanese RPGs, the Black Onyx must be looked at, bare bones it may be. Hey everybody, Eclipse14 here, thanks for watching. Well, at least I got something released in July. I know there's a couple earlier games that may be classified as RPGs, but those games, either the role-playing elements aren't the main focus, or the game is so scarce on info that making a video about it would have been a nigh impossible task. That and I would have lost my chance to talk about the SG-1000. But seriously, if you enjoyed what you saw, feel free to like this video, and if you think my work is worth your time, please consider subscribing, it would be very much appreciated. But in the meantime, I want to thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time.